Swann in Love, Part 1. To admit you to the little nucleus, the little group, the little clan at the Verdurins, one condition sufficed, but that one was indispensable. You must give tacit adherence to a creed, one of whose articles was that the young pianist, whom Madame Verdurin had taken under her patronage that year, and of whom she said, "Really, it oughtn't to be allowed to play Wagner as well as that the young pianist left both Plante and Rubinstein sitting, while Dr. Cottard was a more brilliant diagnostician than Potain. Each new recruit, whom the Verdurins failed to persuade that the evenings spent by other people in other houses than theirs were as dull as ditch water, saw himself banished forthwith. Women being in this respect more rebellious than men, more reluctant to lay aside all worldly curiosity and the desire to find out for themselves whether other drawing-rooms might not sometimes be as entertaining, and the Verdurins feeling, moreover, that this critical spirit and this demon of frivolity might, by their contagion, prove fatal to the orthodoxy of the little church, they had been obliged to expel, one after another, all those of the faithful who were of the female sex. Apart from the doctor's young wife, they were reduced almost exclusively that season. For all that, Madame Verdurin herself was a thoroughly good woman, and came of a respectable middle-class family, excessively rich and wholly undistinguished, with which she had gradually and of her own accord severed all connection. They were reduced almost exclusively to a young woman of a certain class, a Madame de Crécy, whom Madame Verdurin called by her Christian name, Odette, and pronounced a love, and to the pianist's aunt, who looked as though she had at one period answered the bell. Ladies quite ignorant of the world, who in their social simplicity were so easily led to believe that the Princessa de Sagan and the Duchessa de Guermantes were obliged to pay large sums of money to other poor wretches in order to have anyone at their dinner parties, that if somebody had offered to procure them an invitation to the house of either of those great dames, the old doorkeeper and the woman of easy virtue would have contemptuously declined. The Verdurins never invited you to dinner. You had your place laid there. There was never any program for the evening's entertainment. The young pianist would play, but only if he felt inclined, for no one was forced to do anything, and, as Monsieur Verdurin used to say, "We're all friends here, Liberty Hall, you know." If the pianist suggested playing the Ride of the Valkyries or the Prelude to Tristan, Madame Verdurin would protest, not that the music was displeasing to her, but, on the contrary, that it made too violent an impression. "Then you want me to have one of my headaches. You know quite well it's the same every time he plays that. I know what I'm in for. Tomorrow, when I want to get up, nothing doing." If he was not going to play, they talked, and one of the friends, usually the painter who was in favor there that year, would spin, as Monsieur Verdurin put it, a damned funny yarn that made 'em all split with laughter, and especially Madame Verdurin, for whom, so strong was her habit of taking literally the figurative accounts of her emotions, for whom Dr. Cottard, who was then just starting in general practice, would really have to come one day and set her jaw, which she had dislocated with laughing too much. Evening dress was barred because you were all good pals and didn't want to look like the boring people who were to be avoided like the plague, and only asked to the big evenings, which were given as seldom as possible, and then only if it would amuse the painter or make the musician better known. The rest of the time you were quite happy playing charades and having supper in fancy dress, and there was no need to mingle any strange element with the little clan. But just as the good pals came to take a more and more prominent place in Madame Verdurin's life, so the bores, the nuisances, grew to include everybody and everything that kept her friends away from her, that made them sometimes plead previous engagements, the mother of one, the professional duties of another, the little place in the country of a third. If Dr. Cottard felt bound to say good night as soon as they rose from table, so as to go back to some patient who was seriously ill, "I don't know," Madame Verdurin would say. "I'm sure it will do him far more good if you don't go disturbing him again this evening. He will have a good night without you. Tomorrow morning you can go round early and you will find him cured." From the beginning of December it would make her quite ill to think that the faithful might fail her on Christmas and New Year's days. The pianist's aunt insisted that he must accompany her on the latter to a family dinner at her mother's. "You don't suppose she'll die, your mother," exclaimed Madame Verdurin bitterly, "if you don't have dinner with her on New Year's Day, like people in the provinces?" Her uneasiness was kindled again in Holy Week. "Now you, Doctor, you're a sensible, broad-minded man. You'll come, of course, on Good Friday, just like any other day," she said to Cottard in the first year of the little nucleus, in a loud and confident voice, as though there could be no doubt of his answer. But she trembled as she waited for it, for if he did not come she might find herself condemned to dine alone. "I shall come on Good Friday to say good-bye to you, for we are going to spend the holidays in Auvergne. In Auvergne, to be eaten by fleas and all sorts of creatures. A fine lot of good that will do you." And after a solemn pause, "If you had only told us, we would have tried to get up a party and all gone there together, comfortably." And so, too, if one of the faithful had a friend, or one of the ladies a young man, who was liable now and then to make them miss an evening, the Verdurins, who were not in the least afraid of a woman's having a lover, provided that she had him in their company, loved him in their company, and did not prefer him to their company, would say, "Very well then, bring your friend along." And he would be put to the test, to see whether he was willing to have no secrets from Madame Verdurin, whether he was susceptible of being enrolled in the little clan. If he failed to pass, the faithful one who had introduced him would be taken on one side, and would be tactfully assisted to quarrel with the friend or mistress. But if the test proved satisfactory, the newcomer would in turn be numbered among the faithful. And so when, in the course of this same year, the courtesan told Monsieur Verdurin that she had made the acquaintance of such a charming gentleman, Monsieur Swann, and hinted that he would very much like to be allowed to come, Monsieur Verdurin carried the request at once to his wife. He never formed an opinion on any subject until she had formed hers, his special duty being to carry out her wishes and those of the faithful generally, which he did with boundless ingenuity. "My dear, Madame de Crécy has something to say to you. She would like to bring one of her friends here, a Monsieur Swann. What do you say?" Why, as if anybody could refuse anything to a little piece of perfection like that! Be quiet, no one asked your opinion. I tell you that you are a piece of perfection. "Just as you like," replied Odette in an affected tone, and then went on. "You know I'm not fishing for compliments. Very well, bring your friend if he's nice." Now there was no connection whatsoever between the little nucleus and the society which Swann frequented, and a purely worldly man would have thought it hardly worth his while, when occupying so exceptional a position in the world, to seek an introduction to the Verdurins. But Swann was so ardent a lover that, once he had got to know almost all the women of the aristocracy, once they had taught him all that there was to learn, he had ceased to regard those naturalization papers, almost a patent of nobility which the Faubourg Saint-Germain had bestowed upon him, save as a sort of negotiable bond, a letter of credit with no intrinsic value, which allowed him to improvise a status for himself in some little hole in the country, or in some obscure quarter of Paris, where the good-looking daughter of a local squire or solicitor had taken his fancy. For at such times desire, or love itself, would revive in him a feeling of vanity from which he was now quite free in his everyday life, although it was, no doubt, the same feeling which had originally prompted him towards that career as a man of fashion in which he had squandered his intellectual gifts upon frivolous amusements, and had made use of his erudition in matters of art only to advise society ladies what pictures to buy and how to decorate their houses. And this vanity it was which made him eager to shine in the sight of any fair unknown who had captivated him for the moment, with a brilliance which the name of Swann by itself did not emit. And he was most eager when the fair unknown was in humble circumstances, just as it is not by other men of intelligence that an intelligent man is afraid of being thought a fool, so it is not by the great gentlemen, but by boors and bounders that a man of fashion is afraid of finding his social value underrated. Three-fourths of the mental ingenuity displayed, of the social falsehoods scattered broadcast ever since the world began by people whose importance they have served only to diminish, have been aimed at inferiors. And Swann, who behaved quite simply and was at his ease when with a duchess, would tremble for fear of being despised, and would instantly begin to pose were he to meet her Grace's maid. Unlike so many people, who, either from lack of energy or else from a resigned sense of the obligation laid upon them by their social grandeur to remain moored like houseboats to a certain point on the bank of the stream of life, abstain from the pleasures which are offered to them above and below that point, that degree in life in which they will remain fixed until the day of their death, and are content in the end to describe as pleasures, for want of any better, those mediocre distractions, that just not intolerable tedium which is enclosed there with them. Swann would endeavor not to find charm and beauty in the women with whom he must pass time, but to pass his time among women whom he had already found to be beautiful and charming. And these were, as often as not, women whose beauty was of a distinctly common type, for the physical qualities which attracted him instinctively and without reason were the direct opposite of those that he admired in the women painted or sculptured by his favorite masters. Depth of character or a melancholy expression on a woman's face would freeze his senses, which would, however, immediately melt at the sight of healthy, abundant, rosy human flesh. If, on his travels, he met a family whom it would have been more correct for him to make no attempt to know, but among whom a woman caught his eye, adorned with a special charm that was new to him, to remain on his high horse and to cheat the desire that she had kindled in him, to substitute a pleasure different from that which he might have tasted in her company by writing to invite one of his former mistresses to come and join him, would have seemed to him as cowardly an abdication in the face of life, as stupid a renunciation of a new form of happiness, as if, instead of visiting the country where he was, he had shut himself up in his own rooms and looked at views of Paris. He did not immure himself in the solid structure of his social relations, but had made of them so as to be able to set it up afresh upon new foundations wherever a woman might take his fancy, one of those collapsible tents which explorers carry about with them. Any part of it which was not portable or could not be adapted to some fresh pleasure he would discard as valueless, however enviable it might appear to others. How often had his credit with a duchess, built up of the yearly accumulation of her desire to do him some favour for which she had never found an opportunity, been squandered in a moment by his calling upon her, in an indiscreetly worded message, for a recommendation by telegraph which would put him in touch at once with one of her agents, whose daughter he had noticed in the country, just as a starving man might barter a diamond for a crust of bread. Indeed, when it was too late he would laugh at himself for it, for there was in his nature, redeemed by many rare refinements, an element of clownishness. Then he belonged to that class of intelligent men who have led a life of idleness, and who seek consolation, and, perhaps, an excuse in the idea which their idleness offers to their intelligence, of objects as worthy of their interest as any that could be obtained by art or learning, the idea that life contains situations more interesting and more romantic than all the romances ever written. So, at least, he would assure, and had no difficulty in persuading, the more subtle among his friends in the fashionable world, notably the Baron de Charlus, whom he liked to amuse with stories of the startling adventures that had befallen him, such as when he had met a woman in the train and had taken her home with him before discovering that she was the sister of a reigning monarch, in whose hands were gathered at that moment all the threads of European politics, of which he found himself kept informed in the most delightful fashion. Or when, in the complexity of circumstances, it depended upon the choice which the conclave was about to make, whether he might or might not become the lover of somebody's cook. It was not only the brilliant phalanx of virtuous dowagers, generals, and academicians to whom he was bound by such close ties, that Swann compelled with so much cynicism to serve him as panders. All his friends were accustomed to receive from time to time letters which called on them for a word of recommendation or introduction, with a diplomatic adroitness which, persisting throughout all his successive affairs, and using different pretexts, revealed more glaringly than the clumsiest indiscretion a permanent trait in his character and an unvarying quest. I used often to recall to myself, when, many years later, I began to take an interest in his character because of the similarities which, in wholly different respects, it offered to my own, how, when he used to write to my grandfather, though not at the time we are now considering, for it was about the date of my own birth that Swann's great affair began, and made a long interruption in his amatory practices. My grandfather, recognizing his friend's handwriting on the envelope, would exclaim, "Here is Swann asking for something. On guard!" And either from distrust or from the unconscious spirit of devilry which urges us to offer a thing only to those who do not want it, my grandparents would meet with an obstinate refusal the most easily satisfied of his prayers, as when he begged them for an introduction to a girl who dined with us every Sunday, and whom they were obliged, whenever Swann mentioned her, to pretend that they no longer saw, although they would be wondering all through the week whom they could invite to meet her, and often failed in the end to find anyone, sooner than make a sign to him who would so gladly have accepted. Occasionally, a couple of my grandparents' acquaintance, who had been complaining for some time that they never saw Swann now, would announce with satisfaction, and perhaps with a slight inclination to make my grandparents envious of them, that he had suddenly become as charming as he could possibly be, and was never out of their house. My grandfather would not care to shatter their pleasant illusion, but would look at my grandmother as he hummed the air of "What is this mystery? I cannot understand it," or of "Vision fugitive, in matters such as this 'tis best to close one's eyes." A few months later, if my grandfather asked Swann's new friend, "What about Swann? Do you still see as much of him as ever?" the other's face would lengthen. "Never mention his name to me again." "But I thought you were such good friends." He had been intimate in this way for several months with some cousins of my grandmother, dining almost every evening at their house. Suddenly and without any warning he ceased to appear. They supposed him to be ill, and the lady of the house was going to send to inquire for him, when, in her kitchen, she found a letter in his hand, which her cook had left by accident in the housekeeping book. In this he announced that he was leaving Paris and would not be able to come to the house again. The cook had been his mistress, and at the moment of breaking off relations she was the only one of the household whom he had thought it necessary to inform. But when his mistress for the time being was a woman in society, or at least one whose birth was not so lowly, nor her position so irregular that he was unable to arrange for her reception in society, then for her sake he would return to it, but only to the particular orbit in which she moved, or into which he had drawn her. "No good depending on Swann for this evening," people would say. "Don't you remember, it's his American's night at the opera?" He would secure invitations for her to the most exclusive drawing rooms, to those houses where he himself went regularly for weekly dinners or for poker. Every evening, after a slight wave imparted to his stiffly brushed red locks had tempered with a certain softness the ardor of his bold green eyes, he would select a flower for his buttonhole and set out to meet his mistress at the house of one or other of the women of his circle. And then, thinking of the affection and admiration which the fashionable folk, whom he always treated exactly as he pleased, would, when he met them there, lavish upon him in the presence of the woman whom he loved, he would find a fresh charm in that worldly existence of which he had grown weary, but whose substance, pervaded and warmly colored by the flickering light which he had slipped into its midst, seemed to him beautiful and rare, now that he had incorporated in it a fresh love. But while each of these attachments, each of these flirtations had been the realization, more or less complete, of a dream born of the sight of a face or a form which Swann had spontaneously and without effort on his part found charming, it was quite another matter when, one day at the theatre, he was introduced to Odette de Crécy by an old friend of his own, who had spoken of her to him as a ravishing creature with whom he might very possibly come to an understanding, but had made her out to be harder of conquest than she actually was, so as to appear to be conferring a special favor by the introduction. She had struck Swann not, certainly, as being devoid of beauty, but as endowed with a style of beauty which left him indifferent, which aroused in him no desire, which gave him, indeed, a sort of physical repulsion, as one of those women of whom every man can name some, and each will name different examples who are the converse of the type which our senses demand. To give him any pleasure, her profile was too sharp, her skin too delicate, her cheekbones too prominent, her features too tightly drawn. Her eyes were fine, but so large that they seemed to be bending beneath their own weight, strained the rest of her face, and always made her appear unwell or in an ill humor. Some time after this introduction at the theatre, she had written to ask Swann whether she might see his collections, which would interest her so much, she, an ignorant woman with a taste for beautiful things, saying that she would know him better when once she had seen him in his home, where she imagined him to be so comfortable with his tea and his books. Although she had not concealed her surprise at his being in that part of the town, which must be so depressing, and was not nearly smart enough for such a very smart man. And when he had allowed her to come, she had said to him, as she left, how sorry she was to have stayed so short a time in a house into which she was so glad to have found her way at last, speaking of him as though he had meant something more to her than the rest of the people she knew, and appearing to unite their two selves with a kind of romantic bond which had made him smile. But at the time of life, tinged already with disenchantment, which Swann was approaching, when a man can content himself with being in love for the pleasure of loving, without expecting too much in return, this linking of hearts, if it is no longer, as in early youth, the goal towards which love of necessity tends, still is bound to love by so strong an association of ideas that it may well become the cause of love if it presents itself first. In his younger days a man dreams of possessing the heart of the woman whom he loves. Later, the feeling that he possesses the heart of a woman may be enough to make him fall in love with her. At 50, at an age when it would appear, since one seeks in love before everything else a subjective pleasure, that the taste for feminine beauty must play a larger part in its procreation, love may come into being, love of the most physical order, without any foundation in desire. At this time of life a man has already been wounded more than once by the darts of love. It no longer revolves by itself, obeying its own incomprehensible and fatal laws, before his passive and astonished heart. We come to its aid, we falsify it by memory and by suggestion. Recognizing one of its symptoms, we recall and recreate the rest. Since we possess its hymn engraved on our hearts in its entirety, there is no need of any woman to repeat the opening lines, potent with the admiration which her beauty inspires, for us to remember all that follows. And if she begin in the middle, where it sings of our existing henceforward for one another only, we are well enough attuned to that music to be able to take it up and follow our partner without hesitation at the first pause in her voice. Odette de Crécy came again to see Swann. Her visits grew more frequent, and doubtless each visit revived the sense of disappointment which he felt at the sight of a face whose details he had somewhat forgotten in the interval, not remembering it as either so expressive, or, in spite of her youth, so faded. He used to regret, while she was talking to him, that her really considerable beauty was not of the kind which he spontaneously admired. It must be remarked that Odette's face appeared thinner and more prominent than it actually was, because her forehead and the upper part of her cheeks, a single and almost plain surface, were covered by the masses of hair which women wore at that period, drawn forward in a fringe, raised in crimped waves and falling in stray locks over her ears. While as for her figure, and she was admirably built, it was impossible to make out its continuity, on account of the fashion then prevailing, and in spite of her being one of the best dressed women in Paris. For the corset, jutting forwards in an arch, as though over an imaginary stomach, and ending in a sharp point, beneath which bulged out the balloon of her double skirts, gave a woman that year the appearance of being composed of different sections badly fitted together. To such an extent did the frills, the flounces, the inner bodice follow, in complete independence, controlled only by the fancy of their designer or the rigidity of their materials, the line which led them to the knots of ribbon, falls of lace, fringes of vertically hanging jet, or carried them along the bust, but nowhere attached themselves to the living creature, who, according as the architecture of their fripperies drew them towards or away from her own, found herself either straight-laced to suffocation or else completely buried. But after Odette had left him, Swann would think with a smile of her telling him how the time would drag until he allowed her to come again. He remembered the anxious, timid way in which she had once begged him that it might not be very long, and the way in which she had looked at him then, fixing upon him her fearful and imploring gaze, which gave her a touching air beneath the bunches of artificial pansies fastened in the front of her round bonnet of white straw, tied with strings of black velvet. "And won't you," she had ventured, "come just once and take tea with me?" He had pleaded pressure of work and essay, which in reality he had abandoned years ago, on Vermeer of Delft. "I know that I am quite useless," she had replied, "a little wild thing like me beside a learned great man like you. I should be like the frog in the fable. And yet I should so much like to learn, to know things, to be initiated. What fun it would be to become a regular bookworm, to bury my nose in a lot of old papers," she had gone on, with that self-satisfied air which a smart woman adopts when she insists that her one desire is to give herself up, without fear of soiling her fingers, to some unclean task, such as cooking the dinner, with her hands right in the dish itself. "You will only laugh at me, but this painter who stops you from seeing me," she meant Vermeer, "I have never even heard of him. Is he alive still? Can I see any of his things in Paris, so as to have some idea of what is going on behind that great brow which works so hard, that head which I feel sure is always puzzling away about things, just to be able to say, 'There, that's what he's thinking about'? What a dream it would be to be able to help you with your work." He had sought an excuse in his fear of forming new relationships, which he gallantly described as his fear of a hopeless passion. "You are afraid of falling in love? How funny that is, when I go about seeking nothing else, and would give my soul just to find a little love somewhere," she had said, so naturally and with such an air of conviction that he had been genuinely touched. "Some woman must have made you suffer, and you think that the rest are all like her. She can't have understood you. You are so utterly different from ordinary men. That's what I liked about you when I first saw you. I felt at once that you weren't like everybody else. And then, besides, there's yourself," he had continued. "I know what women are. You must have a whole heap of things to do, and never any time to spare. Why, I have never anything to do. I am always free, and I always will be free if you want me. At whatever hour of the day or night it may suit you to see me, just send for me, and I shall be only too delighted to come. Will you do that? Do you know what I should really like? To introduce you to Madame Verdurin, where I go every evening. Just fancy my finding you there, and thinking that it was a little for my sake that you had gone." No doubt, in thus remembering their conversations, in thinking about her thus when he was alone, he did no more than call her image into being among those of countless other women in his romantic dreams. But if, thanks to some accidental circumstance, or even perhaps without that assistance, for the circumstance which presents itself at the moment when a mental state, hitherto latent, makes itself felt, may well have had no influence whatsoever upon that state. But if the image of Odette de Crécy came to absorb the whole of his dreams, if from those dreams the memory of her could no longer be eliminated, then her bodily imperfections would no longer be of the least importance, nor would the conformity of her body, more or less than any other, to the requirements of Swann's taste, since, having become the body of her whom he loved, it must henceforth be the only one capable of causing him joy or anguish.